Hello and welcome to the Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Szamuely. With me today, of course, is co-founder of the Gaggle, Peter Lavelle. And today we have the great honor of being joined by a guest, Tom Luongo, who's, of course, needs no introduction to Gagglers. He has a huge following among Gagglers. He's a writer, a podcaster, a columnist, and political, economic, and geopolitical analyst.
And an all-around really smart guy.
Well, I would say all-around gadfly, but that's fine.
And so obviously there's a great deal to discuss. I mean, I'll kick this off because we spent the weekend, Peter and I, discussing the fight over the speakership, whether it's going to signify anything or it doesn't signify anything. And our conclusion was that it's not going to amount to very much, and that the 20 rebels, whatever you want to call them, achieved something, but the outcome may well be very disappointing. And given the news over the weekend with Nancy Mace, this awful Republican congresswoman from South Carolina, already saying she's not going to vote for, or at least she's sitting on the fence as to whether she's going to vote for the rules changes. The portents are not good. Anyway, Tom, what's your take?
Well, it's interesting. I know that's kind of that would be the baseline analysis. And if you honestly ask me, heart to hand, hand to heart, man, where would you put your money? Yeah, my dominant argument or my dominant position would be I'd probably bet that's not much is going to change. That said, I do think that it's a very important step in the process. Whether it's going to be too little, too late, or anything along those lines, we can certainly get into. But one of the things to think about is that we had 20 people stand up for 5 days or 4 days or whatever it was and derail all of Congress. And that's actually a very powerful statement. And no one, I think, really ever expected them to win. I know I didn't. I hope they won. I hope it would, I hoped at some point, like early Thursday morning, I'm like, I don't know, maybe we'll get to 25. If it gets to 25, it'll get to 30, 35, 40. And then, and then it'll just it'll go from 40 to 150. And then the whole thing would collapse. But always the swamp protects itself. The uniparty protects itself. And the question is, how much did they actually give up? How much are they going to, if these rule changes go through, right? If they pass, it's significant sea change in how Congress will do business. Now, whether or not it's going to happen or not, well, that'll determine whether or not he's going to, be able to stay Speaker of the House. I did a podcast the other day with a guy by the name of Bill Faywell, who's written a book, very interesting book about the cycle of revolutions. And I had Bill on my podcast over the summer, and we were talking about it, handicapping the midterm elections. And it was his argument then, and that once the midterms happened, we would be into the next cycle of the full revolution here in the United States. And this will be the dark days before the dawn, where the counter-revolution against the populist forces will strike back really hard, defend themselves like a dog, and then that will be actually the thing that finally wakes everybody up to go, you know what? This is really not working. They're not listening to us. And I think that the speaker fight helps us along that path to the critical mass of people finally going, you know what, that's enough. Now, whether or not that's going to end with, sorry.
That's something that George and I were talking about over the last couple of days, because we can watch all the kabuki theater we want, okay? And some can argue that this was done for reasons of ego and fame, fundraising. I think all of that is in place, certainly, okay? Sure. But I think the baseline that George and I came up with is that people are watching, okay? They have their kabuki theater, but everybody else has real everyday problems. And I think that we're seeing a continuation of what happened with the primary season in the Republican Party in 2016. And now you can suppress it, you can push it aside, you could try to rebrand it, you can do all the little tricks you want, but it doesn't really change anything if you go out to the base, because all of the focus is on McConnell, a traitor to everything that's I can even think of. All right. And then you have all these Republicans that are these neocon, hawkish people, Ukraine. McCarthy walks around with a Ukraine pin on his lapel, and people see this. Okay, yes, so I tend to think, okay, you have the time, but we have the clocks. Okay, right.
Very no, well put, Peter. No, I think that's something that Bill and I brought up in the podcast we did on that I published on Friday morning or whatever. It's the same thing. Is that, and I live in rural North Florida. Like we were just discussing this before we went live, right? And I live in that country where everybody is looking at this going, I mean, we're almost to the point, but I also live just north of Gainesville, which is kind of like the enclave of the worst woke liberalism. And I'm trying to be clean here. I don't know whether I'm not allowed to use my normal string of invective that I normally would, because I have a particular phrase for these people.
You can say it.
Shit libs, right? They're your classic shit libs. Like, they're as bad as possible. My wife, as a matter of fact, just went to a meeting yesterday with the woman who she rents time at the pottery studio. That woman's more of a kind of classical liberal Democrat, like the Daniel Patrick Moynihan tradition. But she goes to this church, and they were having this meeting of how to talk to people on the other side of the aisle. And the woman joked with my wife. She's like, "We're really diverse. We now let gay and trans people in, and there are 3 different color Priuses in the parking lot." That's what we're dealing with in that area of the world. So I see both things every day, right? I go into my Ace Hardware and I see those guys. I talk with my roofer. I hear one thing. I go to Gainesville and I sit and chat with my millennial board gaming friends, and it's a completely different world, right? Yeah. And so I see all of it. And then, of course, I have my own incredibly based community behind me, and we're all just kind of shaking our heads going, how do you deal with that? I'm like, lots of practice. But you're right. And all that's a long preamble to say that that this all started with Ron Paul waking everybody up in 2008. It's a continuum to, for the last 14 years, and it's not going to end, or almost 15 years now. It's not going to end just because, they were able to circle the ranks and get McCarthy over the line, right? They needed to get him over the line because they need to have another way of ensuring, like, this is a big thing for them, because they have to go to war. Okay. I'm going to not going to think now, let's really pull back out and see what we're talking about here. Martin Armstrong's been banging his shoe on the table like Khrushchev, saying, look, these guys the system is failing. They need to go to war to be able to justify destroying the whole system and blaming it on the Russians and blaming it on the war. And they also have a traitor in their midst, which is the Federal Reserve, who is aggressively pulling back on the global money supply in order to try and stop this, and to try and force Congress into a kind of fiscal responsibility that we've not seen in the United States in 3 generations. And I'm firmly convinced, having watched American politics now for the last year and a half very carefully, like, come on, dude, you have to. I'm saying to myself every day, no, you're wrong about this. And then another data point comes by that I'm not wrong, which is, it's really clear that we can, as the United States, can get out of this fiscal mess if we reform Congress and stop them from spending. Congress wants to spend tens of trillions of dollars to prosecute World War III at Davos's behest, because they're also broke, right? Everybody.
But Tom McCarthy is no revolutionary.
I know he's not. No, I know that. I understand.
Part of this continuum.
I agree with you completely. No argument. It's not. I'm not saying he's not. But that's what this fight was about. And if the rules go through, Matt Gaetz will just stand up and get rid of him. And when the uniparty tries to collapse around him, if he betrays this deal, it's going to create another wave of dissent within Congress and within the base. And he may only last 3 or 4 months as speaker. So I'm again just laying odds on these things. I'm not saying that these are. I don't have a crystal ball here.
Just on this point now. The spending, you've got this, spend. That's right. All they do now. And then you mentioned the Federal Reserve, right, which wants to cut back on the money supply, and maybe. And I was just wondering what you think of that. Maybe they want to provoke a global recession with a view to hitting Russia. I mean, they kind of want,
that's part of it, sure.
Because Russia's basically evaded the sanctions because it's found alternative markets for its products. But a global recession would hit Russia because then suddenly they would, it won't be able to sell it. Anyway, what do you think?
But this is why China waited until after the oil price cap went into place to end zero COVID. Like, so the oil price cap goes into place from the EU on December 5th. On December 7th, Xi says, oh, well, zero COVID is over. Now we're going to allow Omicron, whatever this is, Omicron 2.0, to go through China. It'll take about 6 to 8 weeks. And then China's economy is going to come back with a vengeance. And the price of oil is going to skyrocket because it's already underinvested and we're already in a deficit as of today. Forget 6 months from now when China reopens. So the geopolitical moves here about, I think what the Fed is actually trying to do with pulling back on global dollar supply is understanding, and clearly Powell's talked about this, that their de-dollarization is happening and we have to pull back. If not, we're going to have hyperinflation here in the United States. Right. So we have to do this. But he can't say that to a domestic audience. He has to use, well, unemployment is good, inflation's too high, blah, blah. He has to play that.
You mentioned the word hyperinflation, and I think it's very key right now, because when you look at all of the pricing of assets and the level of debts that's going on, the only thing that can save their bacon is hyperinflation, because when you have hyperinflation, you can pay off your debts. Okay. Right.
Well, that's
it works for a very specific small percentage of people here.
Of course. And that was back to my original point about why both Europe and the United States and the UK all want the war, because that's how you can justify all the spending to keep the system from collapsing and default on all the debts. That's what they all want. Okay, they all want it up on Capitol Hill. But there are certain people, I think, that realize that we don't have to go this route. There are many ways to recapitalize the United States, which is the interesting part about it. And if we were to turn around, and I've been making this argument for a little over a year, saying, look, if the United States were, as a political entity, would have finally issue or repudiate ridiculous fiscal spending. If we were to say we are going to get our house in order, if you look at the rules, if you look at the concessions that Matt Gaetz and company got, they're all it's all right there. We're going to hold the budget. We're going to hold the budget for 2024, 2022 levels. We're going to balance it within this amount of time. We're going to do all these things, and all of these things to stop Congress from spending. Now, whether or not Congress is going to abide by this deal is a different story. But the signposts are there. This is what the world, including the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians and everybody, this is what they want from the U.S. because they know that if the U.S. does this, then the entire empire has to be defunded in the process, because that is the implication by all of these things. Now, whether or not that's going to happen, again, is the big question. And I know everybody's sitting there looking at me, but that's the out. And it's the out for the entire world.
But what's really interesting, because there's not a whole lot to see. I live on the other side of the world, so I watch, news on YouTube, and so I was watching Maria Bartiromo, and she was going on and on about spending cuts, fiscal conservative, responsibility, and then she brings on some clown about, but we have to increase defense spending.
I know. The Republicans are hopeless, but the thing is that the GOP has always been hopeless because the GOP is staffed by the same group of dirty globalists that the Democrats are run by. The difference between the two of them is that the Republicans mask it. They're the controlled opposition. They've always had. It's a uniparty, and we all know this. And what these guys did was just to say, look, we don't have anything to lose. We know McCarthy's just going to shut us up, not put us on any committees or anything else. So fine, we're going to force as much out of him and as much out into the open as possible. No different than when Elon Musk took over Twitter and forced a whole bunch of stuff out into the open that we all knew already, but now is been proven, and now we get to wake up another 15% of the population. We get a bunch of people say, well, that's just a conspiracy theory. Well, no, now it's actually true, and it's going to convince a certain percentage of people that it's, yes, indeed, what we feared about all this stuff is true. They spent taxpayer money at the FBI to pay Twitter to reelect Joe Biden. Like, this is 10 times, 100 times worse than Watergate, and yet, yeah, whatever. Like, it's this de rigueur. Like, really? Like, okay, they think that they can get away with that by just pushing all this through out of the media cycle and outside the Overton window and shifting the Overton window, but it doesn't work that way. What happens is you get people really angry, and then one day you wake up and it's like what happened in Brazil yesterday.
But the interesting thing is that, I mean, let's say the next continuing resolution comes down the pike, or the next omnibus bill, I mean, McCarthy's just going to turn to the Democrats. I mean, he's got all the Democrats are going to vote for it.
Right.
So, okay. So
I
30 or
I
40
understand.
Republicans will not vote for it. So big deal. It still will go through by overwhelming.
But he will lose the
majority.
speakers. But if these rules pass, he will lose the speakership the next morning. Okay. And we will start this process all over again, which is unprecedented in modern history.
Well, it happened with Boehner. I mean, they kind of got rid of Boehner, but what happened then? They got Paul Ryan instead. So
I know, but things are different today than they were 10 years ago. Like I really want to make that the way I see things today versus then. Back then, I was with you guys. Like hell, I was checked out of geopolitics at that point. I stopped even listening. A friend of mine would call me up on the phone and want to talk politics. I'm like, why? Just buy gold and put your head under the covers. These people are taking us to World War III in 10 years. Like, what's the deal? And then when the British Parliament defied David Cameron over invading Syria, that was the moment I went, oh, hold it, stuff's changing. And then I had to start listening again. And that's actually about the same time that I got the job with Newsmax and started on the path that I'm on now. But privately, back then, I was completely checked out on this stuff.
I think one of the things that I find very curious and very, very important, and George and I have discussed this many times, is that if we look society-wide, politics, we have the uniparty, you have this wokeism in academia and in entertainment, and it is all pervasive. It's very, very powerful. It's extremely well-funded. And it's still a 50-50 country. One side has all of the resources, all of the institutional power, and it's still, and that's why I think that, it's like a mousetrap. They're just pushing it further and further back. And this is just what we saw over the last 5 days was just a short intermission, if you want to call it that way. But, I'm just simply amazed. I mean, I always tell my friends, my foreign friends, when you look at American elections, don't look at the states, don't look at the congressional districts, look at the counties, and then you'll see that's the divide right there. Oh, yeah. And when I look at all the machinations that are going on, what we saw over the last 5-6 days here, that's just the tiny surface of what's really going on right now, because I think the turbulence is so much deeper and it's getting more and more organized. One thing that, I think is slowly but surely galvanizing a lot of people is the fate of the January 6 people. Okay, I mean that is really terrifying.
It is.
How can the U.S. talk about democracy, freedom of speech, rule of law, rules-based order when they have hundreds of people still, many of them still in solitary confinement? I know.
It's insane, and it's disturbing. And it's disturbed people on a very, very deep level. And I don't speak to a lot of people on a day-to-day basis because, I work from home and I live in the middle of nowhere and I don't, and on the best of days, I'm barely fit for human consumption. But, the best I can do here is when I talk to people about these things, this is what I hear. And these are issues that cross the political divide. It is not right for people to be held in solitary confinement for going to the steps of the Capitol and waving a placard. I'm sorry. Not when it's pretty obvious. We now know from the January 6th committee that tried to, put Donald Trump in jail, which is the dumbest thing I've ever seen. Well, not the dumbest thing. I've seen worse than that, but, only in the movie theater. But to watch that play itself out is, that's bothering people on both sides of the political divide. It's an easy wedge issue to say, look, is it right? Whether you agree with, whether you agree with them or not, you have the right to accost Supreme Court justices in their homes, and these people can't go to the Capitol and wave a placard. Are you kidding me? And they're like, well, we're not spouting hate. I'm like, oh, okay. Those are the people in Gainesville. I'm like, oh, so everything is okay in service of fighting hate.
But that's
all right.
That's
so now that I know that, I also know that I also know what list to put you on.
Right.
But when the Civil War comes, you and I are going to have a real hard time.
Right. But that's why I was surprised when you thought that the populist revolt would succeed, because, even if it's a 50-50 country, one part, the 150, has all the institutions of power.
Sure.
They control, even, we saw what happened with Trump.
But George, the institutions are failing.
They are,
Davos's entire shtick is to destroy our faith in our own institutions. They're doing it brilliantly at every level, and they're all and now we're all looking at them going, "Oh, really? The rules don't apply anymore. We don't have to listen to you people."
Right.
Good. And that's what's coming.
That's right. But what happens when the people revolt? The government has the means of coercion, and we saw what happened January the 6th.
I hate. Peter lives in Russia. You guys know how big Russia is. I don't think people really understand how big the United States is. I live 23 miles from a Walmart. Let's just stop and put it all in perspective, baby. I live 23 miles in 2 different directions from a Walmart or my bank. Okay, that's where I live. And I got news for you. That's 20% of the American population. It's big. I've driven across this country. I've done it in a day, which is insane. But I drove back from northern New Mexico to Florida in a little over a day. But dude, it's a big country, and I think that the idea that that they can pacify all of us is insane. It's not possible. The red states, if they continue to push this divide the way it is, and I think the recent report about the demographic shift that's happening in the United States is very apropos to this conversation, right? The Bureau of Census, I think, came out with the latest statistics about the net migration from California to Florida and all that stuff. When you dug into those numbers, Zero Hedge had a great article on Wednesday about it, and then the next day they dug in further and found out where people are going to want to move and why they want to move in 2023. And 61% of them we're moving for political reasons.
I saw that.
Now, this has been going on for years. And I see it where I live. Okay. I absolutely, every time I drive into my hometown, my little town where I live, where I can, it's the next ring of towns to start seeing money come.
Tom, but
I see it, and it's becoming redder by the day.
There are people on Fox News that talk about a 50-state strategy, which George and I have scoffed at just for the very reasons of the demographics right now, because it is. I think we've crossed the Rubicon. I really do believe that there's this. I mean it's what is it? It's a state of secession of mind. Okay, the country maybe not physically in secession right now, but in the body politic, a lot of people have already left.
Yeah, that is a fair point. I can tell you that we feel that way down here. Okay, and everybody I talk to about this in Florida already gets it. They don't want Ron DeSantis running for president, by the way. We want Ron to stay exactly where he is, where he has real power.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
But at the same time, we also don't want, I remind people about this, and I say, look, at the same time, we also don't want, if the United States is to break apart, and I have a fundamental, I kind of knew we were going to go here today. If the United States is going to break apart, just like the European Union, just like, in many ways, just like Russia, just like China, even India, all of these states in their own way are all too big from an energy. I mean, I'm a chemist and a scientist as well. So I look at systems from a variety of different perspectives. And I have a real fundamental problem with bigness. I'm also a hardcore libertarian. So of course I have a problem with bigness, but it's because of the mathematical problems of fragility that come with big systems. They require more sophisticated ecosystems, more sophisticated supply chains to maintain themselves. Okay. I think the United States is too big. I've been saying it personally, ask any of my friends, ask my wife, I've been saying it for 20 years. Same thing, I believe the European Union is going in the exact wrong direction. I think trying to hold China together, I think Xi is going to have a very interesting problem trying to hold China together. This is not a critique of them. I just think that, and this is not the standard, like, quote unquote, neoconservative critique from a demographic perspective, because I think the demographic analysis is nonsense. Like guys like Peter Zeihan and Kyle Bass and the rest of them, and George Friedman over at Stratford, I think they're all just full of shit. I'm just talking about fundamentally that a system that big cannot serve the people properly, and that eventually the forces of decentralization and the forces of human ingenuity eventually break these big systems apart.
Yeah,
but they should always happen on their own terms, organically, and not be forced from the outside. And what we're seeing in the United States is we're getting attacked from it's clearly we're being attacked from outside to be broken apart. Now, it's been going on since the day after Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown. The Brits have always wanted their colonies back, but it's gotten really bad in these last 10 years with this now invalidating our national elections, selecting Joe Biden to be president. I mean, all of this stuff. It's very
but that's you're right, but that's a long-term.
Of course it is.
Yeah, that's long-term.
But we're being forced into this decade.
But for instance, how at the moment it's hard to see how Republicans can actually win any elections. I mean, the Democrats have now created a foolproof system.
Agreed. I know, and that just means that we're going to have to.
I don't think we will see another Republican president in our lifetime. Sorry.
Yeah,
we may not. I'm at that point, but I got news for you. If they pull again what they've pulled in 2020 and pulled in 2022, people are going to be like, you know what? No. No.
Yeah, but I think, but it's kind of in line of what we're talking about. Then why should people care? I mean, why participate in the charade? Okay,
well, that's
I think that's again. I like what you said about people don't want DeSantis to run for president. Stay governor. Okay, that's a better, because one day maybe being governor of Florida is going to be far more important than being president of what is called.
It already is.
I find that hard to believe.
It already is.
National elections have always been the key. I do think that you hold the presidency, and Biden, in winning that election, that was an important
what is
goal. That's an important goal. I mean,
there's always the aftershock to that.
You've always had governors who could do this, that, and the other in their own states, but ultimately the ultimate prize is the national election. Then that is the one office in the country which is national, the presidency.
And it is a very
presidency.
It is a very powerful position, and it's one that Donald Trump did not understand the power of.
Yeah,
that's the biggest criticism I have of Donald Trump.
For sure.
He didn't understand the power that he wielded, because he could have easily just called
But he was a dictator, Tom. He was a dictator. I mean,
he was a dictator. Mitch McConnell would be in jail, and he would have, and then his cabinet would have been Rand Paul and Robert Malone and all the other people, and that would have been the end of it. Here's what it's like: turn to McConnell and go, "No, Mitch, you're going to jail for trafficking cocaine. Now get out of here. Now let's move on." Like, if he had any sense whatsoever about the power of his actual office, he didn't. And that's where that was my biggest problem with fundamentally, when you really stop to look at it, that was my fundamental problem with Donald Trump. But Trump's failure is that he really believes that the system, he kind of believed in this myth of America, and that America still worked and functioned and all of this. He was very naive, and it showed in his presidency. And basically they spent just 4 years just trying to hold the tide at bay. And better him, but by doing so, he exposed a whole lot of people. He accelerated all of their timetables. The thing is, and the point, but to go back to what I was saying earlier, I really do think, I don't think China wants a disorderly destruction or dissolution of the United States. I don't think the Russians want it. I don't think the Chinese want it. I don't think the Iranians want it. I don't think anybody wants it. The only people who want it are Europe. If you really look at what they're saying, if you look at what they're doing, they absolutely want it, because they want the European Union to be the center of the West and not the United States. And they want to transfer that power there. I see that so clearly.
It's never going to happen.
Yeah. I know it's never going to happen, but that's what they want, because then they want to move it to the UN. From there, they want to move the power to the UN, kick Russia off the Security Council, which is nonsense. I think these are all grandiose plans. I see what these people want. I'm not saying they're going to get there.
Well, George,
that's a different part of the flow chart. What I'm going to get.
What George is trying to ground us more in the contemporary period, and I think he's right here. And the European Union, as it stands right now, is the weakest link in the world. Okay?
Agreed.
I mean, in many ways, the Ukraine conflict is going to break the European Union one way or another, or certainly fracture it very, very badly.
I agree.
And that's of their own doing. No, I mean, if you look at the Eurasian landmass, 20 years, 30 years from now, the western tip of it, called Europe, is going to be the most irrelevant part of the global economy.
And
it was all done intentionally, self-inflicted, because of ideology. Okay,
absolutely.
And I want to push back a little bit about what you said about breaking things up. But Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, the other stands, they want to come back to Russia. Okay, when you look at half of the population of Ukraine, they want to come back to Russia, okay? And what reason why I'm saying this is, and I'm not touting Russian culture or civilization. Sure. I'm not trying to do that. But the one element, that we haven't really touched about, or George touched about a little bit, is the use of coercion. See, the European Union will use coercion to keep itself together. The United States definitely uses coercion to maintain.
We learned it from the Europeans, but yes.
And okay, so
sorry,
but for me, I mean, when I look at history, you have to take obviously geopolitics into account, but you have to look at ideology, you have to look at economic structures and class interests and stuff like that.
Absolutely.
The combination that the West has right now is a lose on every single dimension. Okay, others. No, I mean, I'll give you just a small example. Netflix left Russia, okay, probably for the better, okay. But people would watch this and hear, and they just watch it with just kind of weird amazement. Is that people actually believe that stuff? People want to live like that, and Netflix ended up being a very interesting foil because it's like we know now exactly what we don't want from guys.
No,
okay,
no,
and that,
I agree.
And that's rejuvenizing their culture and their sense of identity, because one really important element of what your identity is what you don't want to become. Okay,
no, yeah, Peter. When I was talking about China, Russia, Iran, these systems maybe having to break up, it's the counterpoint to the neocon Stratfor CIA narrative that we're going to break Russia up and then take all its stuff. I don't believe that. I've done multiple podcasts with Joaquin Flores and Alistair Crook and others, and we've talked about that these are civilizations first and systems second. Right. Exactly. That Russia, China, Iran are civilizations first with an identity that they then can they can be run by whatever system they happen to think they need at that moment in time, but they're more than willing to shift as they need to. All I'm saying is, like, in the grand scheme of things, do I think that it may be better in the long? I mean, like, I'm talking 50 or 100 years from now. Yeah, you may see the Russian Federation willingly break itself up because the divisions are so minor but things are so peaceful that they would want to do that. And that's perfectly reasonable. But what I'm worried about is all this is the enforcement of it and the coercion of it. What is the point you?
It's very interesting what you said, because Iran, China, Russia, they are civilizational projects. They have been for time immemorial. But the West has never created, or at least it's. Can you de-anchor? I mean, or detach?
No, we're obsessed with our systems.
Yeah, because what they've done is that one of the things I find fascinating is the West uses the language of the Enlightenment to destroy its Enlightenment. Okay, and that's one of the things I think is interesting, is they rely upon systems and ideology, and that's no solution for the human condition. Human condition is basically based on a civilizational fulcrum. Okay, but the West believes in its systems, believes in its ideology, and is detaching itself from its civilization, which I think is a complete dead end.
Well, yeah, I look at the ideology of the globalists and their mouthpiece, Klaus Schwab, and their other mouthpieces, and that's all Klaus Schwab is. He's a mouthpiece, and I go, well, there you go. That's what they believe in, and that's what they're trying to implement, and they will brook no argument about how that will be put into practice, and that should scare you. And you can call that communism, you can call fascism, you can call whatever ism you want. It's a ridiculous anti-human collectivism that is of zero value to humanity. It's a Malthusian bad salvation of a single factor variable equation that doesn't even bear on 99% of humanity. It's insane what they think. Excuse me. I have to let the cat in or he'll get angry. So
I have pets, I understand.
Come on, buddy. Go on inside. Hi, buddy. All right, go ahead. So that was all I was going to say. So
right. So now we're just thinking about this the war in Ukraine. So as far as we can tell, the United States wants to keep this war going. I mean, that's for them. This is they're making a lot of money on this. It's weakening Russia. They think it's basically going to be a drain, a debilitating drain on Russia. Then this goes back to a point that I was making earlier, that what the United States sees is that Russia has been able to withstand sanctions. They were hoping that the sanctions would bring Russia to its knees. It's failed to bring Russia to its knees. They now, so they have one other option, which is to try to trigger a global recession, and that might that could hit the Russian economy, because suddenly there's not going to be any demand for Russian products.
Yeah, I think again, I think I think that is their plan. I don't think it's going to work. I think we're not going to have a
very risky.
It is incredibly risky, because you're inviting, like I've been saying forever, like, they're inviting chaos in order to create an opportunity to then, turn that into a shift. I'm like, but they think they can ride herd over the chaos, but by definition, you can't control chaos because it's chaos, right? So George, I've thought about that angle a lot. I really have. And looking at the landscape from the structure of the capital markets as they exist right now, and looking as we come into 2021, 2023, sorry. I just put out my big 10 predictions for the year over the weekend. It was on Zero Hedge yesterday morning. And one of them is that we're going to see the last bull market in the US dollar, but that's only going to be versus other fiat currencies. Okay. It's going to be in a bear market against tangible assets, and a bull market versus the euro and others. At the same time, it probably won't be in a bull market against the Chinese yuan. I'm not sure about the Russian ruble. Depends on what the Russians want to do with the ruble. They can do whatever they want with it, and whatnot. Because Zoltan Pozar just had his latest missive from Credit Suisse about this, and what his takeaway points are. Posted up a big Twitter thread this morning talking about the differences between our outlooks for 2023. Though they're very similar. And I think we're looking at stagflation in the United States this year. I think we're looking at slow growth with higher inflation. So we're looking at 7 to 8% inflation with 2 to 3% growth, nominal growth. It'll be terrible for everybody. It's not good, but it will not be a quote unquote recession. It will be in real terms, but not in nominal terms. It'll be a depression in real terms. But with China opening back up again, and I don't know that I see that as the real outcome here. I think that, we're more worried about, especially if they want to go to war, like commodity prices are going to go through the roof. Mm-hmm. And if we're going to get a global recession, it's because copper is going to go back to $6 a pound, and oil is going to go back to $120 a barrel. Right. So, and those are kind of my baseline cases, maybe not for 2023, but certainly for 2024. So, when you put it all together that way, what the Fed is trying to do is break Europe, and they're trying to break the offshore dollar markets. And I'm going to have Daniel DiMartino Booth on my podcast, hopefully in about and I'm going to go through her with her on this. I really do believe that this is part of the issue, because this is how the Fed gets control over its own monetary policy. Okay, because we have a lot of shifts happening this year.
So to be clear, basically to break the euro to the advantage of the dollar. That's what you're saying.
Well, yeah. Well, clearly, if it's a fight between the ECB, the BIS, and the Federal Reserve, why do you think they all have the same agenda? Because they don't. They don't. Because BIS and the ECB have aspirations, and the Fed and its political arm of the Fed, which is Congress, which has been betraying the Fed left and right for years with profligate spending that the Fed is forced to monetize. Okay, if the Fed why do you think Powell is pulling back as hard as he is? And why do you? And I firmly believe, I got up this morning, I'm watching the markets this morning, and I'm like, you're still mispriced. Fed's raising interest rates by 50 basis points in 3.5 weeks, and LIBOR is still trading 9 basis points over SOFR. We got a problem here. We have a massively mispriced credit market, and that rate shock is coming either at the end of this month or sometime in the end of Q1, early Q2, where everybody will finally realize, a critical mass of people will wake up and realize that the Fed put is dead, and that the Fed is trying desperately to stop the train, and they have to, because they have multiple problems as I've outlined. They've got de-dollarization, which is causing offshore dollars to come home. You've got a massive offshore leveraged dollar market known as the Eurodollar system, which is how Europe funds itself at this point, and how many aspects of the global economy fund itself, most of which funds the empire that we all hate, right? And that's FTX is part of that. Yeah. And I firmly believe that the Fed took down FTX on election night. Like, to me, that's all like this. Like, oh yeah, I would have done that. Yeah, of course, because now we have proof that they stole an election with using tax money laundered through a crypto project and Ukrainian funding. I'm like, oh my God, they've got them dead to rights. If there's any justice in the world, this is what's going to come out. I don't know if it is, but I can see it all laying out. I'm like it all makes sense to me. And so the Fed, if the Fed is under existential threat by a bunch of people that want to do away with the commercial banking system, which they do, then it only makes sense that they would fight these people left and right to tooth and claw. And so the best way to do that is to just take away the dollars. And they haven't taken away the domestic dollar flow. M2 is just starting to crest here in the United States. But the Fed has $5 trillion worth of treasuries on its balance sheet, or whatever the number is. It's some ludicrous number. And they've got $2 trillion in a reverse repo account. They have assets on both sides of the domestic bank balance sheets to liquefy whatever comes down the pike, but everybody else doesn't. And that's the important part to understand. I'm like, I do this a lot. I sit here, if I'm at the gaming table and I'm like, okay, how am I going to beat these? How am I going to beat these people? Like, what's my winning solution here? What's my firing solution for taking everybody out? I'm like, oh, it's this clearly. Jack interest rates up, and then watch the world, and then watch my overt enemies burn. The Russians are insulated from this. They're mostly de-dollarized. The Chinese are mostly the Chinese were cutting what everybody else was spending. So
what happens if it doesn't work?
If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. Then the United States is screwed. It's screwed. Like we're screwed. I mean, like this.
It's just one of the things that I find really truly extraordinary is that what you've mapped out here is so amazingly dangerous. And given the decision-making processes and results of our governing elites over the last 30 years, I have no confidence they have any idea of what they're doing. I mean, this is really you're playing.
It is.
The thing is that, and George and I have talked about this a lot. You can have the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq. You can have regime change, attempt in Syria, destroy Libya. But that's this. The American public is barely aware of these things. Barely aware. I mean, I saw a report a couple of years ago that in the first decade of the 21st century, Americans got on average 3 minutes of foreign news a week. Okay, so but what you're describing here, that's front page for everybody, 24/7 for the working and middle class people. This is existential for them, not this thought out war in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Well, the thing is, we have a whole lot of mispriced assets here in the United States. We have a whole lot of mispriced assets all around the world. So far, what are we seeing? We're seeing housing prices are starting to come down a little bit. But that doesn't mean that, they're coming down from baselines from 2 years ago. It's like saying commodity prices have come down. Well, yeah, okay, natural gas is 385 a million BTUs. That used to be a sell signal in the U.S. domestic natural gas market. You got the $4 and you're like, I'm going short natural gas because it's going back to $1.50. It always does. Now it's the new baseline. So $700,000 hovels on the outskirts of San Francisco, 2 ones on a quarter-acre postage stamp note for $700,000. Okay, they're going to come back down to $400,000, but there's still $200,000 over what those people paid for those houses 15 years ago. So they're not sitting on negative equity. So the people who bought those houses recently, they're in trouble. Guess who that is? That's BlackRock.
That's BlackRock. Yeah.
Okay. So I expect BlackRock. I look at the situation today and I'm like, I really do think, and I've talked to some people about this who are much closer to the centers of financial power in the United States than I am. I have patrons who are, they're kind of close. And I've sat and chatted with them about it. And I did a talk at a recent high net worth investor conference about this. And we just sat there, smoking cigars. I got a rye in one hand, I got a cigar in the other. And I'm like, okay, I'm Jamie Dimon. Hey, everybody. And there's John Solomon over at Goldman Sachs. There's, Brian Moynihan at BOFA. There's the guy over from Wells. I don't know all the CEOs' names. I'm like, guys, this Fink guy, isn't he getting a little uppity? What did they do? What did BlackRock do in asset management fees last quarter? $100 billion? It's a good book of business, don't you think? I'll take half. You guys can split it up amongst yourself, because they're sitting on how much shareholder equity? $38 billion. How much crap real estate did they buy because they got access to the discount window, which is BlackRock's secret power, superpower? God knows. With BlackRock and their subsidiaries and right? You start thinking about that situation, and you look at BlackRock's chart, clearly a bankruptcy chart waiting, and they're doubling down everywhere they can to try and pull political strings to save themselves. And every time that Powell and Larry Fink meet, I don't think people have got it right. Fink is going to Powell hat in hand, not the other way around. And somehow in this country, certainly in the financial press, people have gotten this idea that the Fed chairman is somehow subservient to anyone else. Like, really? I think presidents are subservient to the Fed chair. I always felt that way under Greenspan, under Bernanke, and under Yellen. Why do we not think that under Powell? Well, maybe it's because we're supposed to not think of that way, because Powell's cut from a different cloth. Powell's cut from private equity. He's not an egghead academician from Harvard. Okay, he's not a guy who's never worked a day in his life. He's put real risk capital on the table for the very people whose banks he represents. He was put in power by Wall Street under Trump in order to do what he's doing right now. COVID was derailed that. He was trying to do this back in 2018.
So what happens to BlackRock? I mean, BlackRock gets bailed out.
I think BlackRock gets divvied up. Like, it's the Lehman Brothers story all over again. When Dick Fold got himself in trouble, Jamie Dimon is like, I don't want to buy that, but I guess the Fed strong-armed him into buying it for what, $1 a share, half it, and it had to be done with Fed money that he didn't have to pay back. It was ridiculous. I just think this is, you're dealing with the sharks. You're dealing with the apex predators of the global financial system, and I just don't think they're going to roll over for a bunch of. I just don't think they're going to roll over for a bunch of guys, but for a bunch of eggheads over in Europe. I just don't see it.
You mentioned FTX. It's a very interesting story. Sure. It seems to me, considering the political connections that this character had, Sam Bankman-Fried, I mean, it seems very convenient that they were all talking about regulation. Of course, this fraudster, he wanted regulation to be catered for his company so he could be the monopoly. It's obvious to me. Okay,
sure.
He was throwing around a lot of money here, but I think that there's others who are saying, yeah, we kind of like the model, but we don't want you to have it. we would like to have that, and we would like to have control of it. Because it goes in line with you're talking about de-dollarization, getting rid of the current financial system. I mean, we all have to have some kind of means to exchange, and a lot of people have talked about crypto and stuff like that. And he came up with a model, fraudulent as it was, but it seems to me is that, we kind of like the model, we can tweak it, but we want to control it. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, here's the thing. So FTX, and my partner and I, Dexter White, did a podcast on this, what we thought it was. It was a Ponzi Hoover. So it was a big Ponzi vacuum, right? Let's hoover up all the Ponzi's within crypto and then fill them full of magic beans as reserves, but steal all the cash that they actually had on their balance sheets, whatever it was. What I really think FTX was a new shadow banking system that was nascent. Okay, that we had the offshore banking system of the old British protectorates and whatnot, which we nominally call the shadow banking system today, and the offshore dollar markets and the leveraged loan markets overseas, part of which got into trouble with the Bank of England and the pension funds over last summer, right? I think FTX was absolutely a means by which to create a new offshore dollar market, with the Fed trying to collapse the existing offshore dollar system, turn it into a crypto system, sell it to the millennials as the new way out, and then once it got critical mass, would not be able to be taken down. If it had enough faith in itself, it was going to take another couple of years, right? Because it's, you're never going to get that done in 18 months or 2 years. But imagine if they hadn't blown up for another 2 or 3 years. And now there's a significant amount of real capital in there, and it's doing a significant amount of global trade or, payment layer or whatnot. All of a sudden, this thing gets escape velocity in trust at the same time as the Fed's. Clearly, this was a threat to the Federal Reserve. So again, clearly another threat, another way of dealing with and destroying any attempt to weasel out from underneath the offshore, and keep the offshore dollar markets alive. Christine Lagarde at the ECB about a year and a half ago said, look, we have to do something about crypto regulation, because if we don't regulate crypto, it will be an escape hatch for people trying to escape the existing system. And if there's an escape hatch, people will use it. And she meant that as, oh my God, we can't possibly let that happen. That's, she's getting the vapors over here. Her neck scarves are turning red. Oh my God. Right? No, the same thing. But she says that at the same time that these same freaking people are behind creating FTX to do the exact same thing and back it with magic beans. It was a prototype retail central bank digital currency.
So why did
it had to be blown up.
So why did they pull the plug then on? Why did they pull the plug on FTX then?
Because the Fed has no interest in a retail central bank digital currency. The Fed has the U.S. dollar. What does it need that for?
Well, I mean,
there's no desire at the Fed for a retail CBDC. None, zero. It's not even a pilot project stage.
But don't you think, I mean, and you obviously know far more about this than I do, but it seems to me that kind of going along this, escape velocity, I like that phrase. I mean, if something like that kind of platform does have the potential for escape velocity, you want to control it, okay? You don't want it to be a separate entity.
Right, or you want to destroy it, one or the other.
Yeah, I mean, well, like I said, the model is out there. I mean, somebody's going to try it again, but they're going to know who to answer to, and it will be like a parallel. Well, there'll be certain, obviously the people in control want to maintain it. That's the nature of power. Okay, so we can have a successful crypto platform, just that we're going to regulate it, okay, and to our advantage, and of course it won't hurt our holy financial institutions.
Well, there's this. I think it's funny, again, I listen to Powell very carefully. He says things that no other Fed chairman has ever said. He said things like, there's room in the world for more than one reserve currency. He said this during a Humphrey Hawkins testimony last year. Everybody misses this. Then 2 months later, he told Christine Lagarde, oh, by the way, I have a dual mandate of stable prices and full employment, not to fight climate change. At which point she lost her mind. 2 weeks later, he raised the reverse repo rate 5 basis points over the Fed funds rate and destroyed the euro, like literally overnight, right?
Yeah.
So I don't think the Fed, I don't think Wall Street. I mean by Wall Street, I'm talking about Wall Street that's in it for itself and its power base within the United States. If they're going to win, I'm talking, I believe that Wall Street's now split. So kind of like City of London is also split. There are Davos banks within City of London. There are Davos banks on Wall Street. And then there are non-Davos banks in both places. And so there are factions within them. I think JP Morgan, Goldman, Wells, maybe Citigroup are all with the Fed. They're all the major shareholders of the New York Fed anyway, so it makes sense. And then the other ones like Bank of New York Mellon and a few others are absolutely, they're the ones that were involved in trying to rape Russia 30 years ago, and certainly Bank of New York Mellon was. So when you start to like lay this stuff out, right, in that respect, it's pretty obvious. And when I talk about Wall Street and the Fed, I mean, or what I call the New York boys and the Fed, I think they understand that crypto, and when I mean crypto, I actually mean Bitcoin as opposed to crypto. Crypto is a completely separate thing, but Bitcoin is an asset that they can work with. And I think that they all want in on Bitcoin at a certain level. They understand that in order to recapitalize the United States, and that both gold and Bitcoin will play a very powerful role in this. It's why there's a lot of Wall Street investment from those guys in places like co-located Bitcoin mining operations at gas flaring plants and nuclear plants and everything else that's going on around the United States right now. It's been going on for a couple of years now. I had a friend of mine who was actually brokering all of those deals in the nuclear industry, FYI. And during the 2020-2021 rally. So I've been blowing people. I'll blow your mind right now. I think at the end of all of this, I think the Fed puts Bitcoin on its balance sheet. It'll take 10 years, but I think they go there. If the Fed wins, if they don't win, it doesn't matter. Like, you know what I mean? But if the Fed wins this fight in the way I've laid it out, especially with the end of LIBOR, with SOFR now taking over and that's another rabbit hole we'd have to go down to explain to people what I'm talking about. But understand that the United States, for the first time in the 200 plus years of its history, has a debt indexing rate that is not tied to European debt, not tied to European banking, because that's what LIBOR is. It's tied to European banking. We now have our own debt indexing rate that we can now actually, I don't know, oh my God, gasp, price our own risk capital. We've never had the ability to do that. We've always had to ask London for what that rate was. Think about how much power London has always had over us. And now you understand why this
LIBOR has been shown to be very fraudulent.
Situation is different. If that wasn't there, guys, you and I, we'd all be on the same boat that oh yeah, it's all one big club and we ain't in it and it's all going down.
As a friend of mine put LIBOR, he said we're pronouncing it wrong. It's lie more.
Exactly. So and this is why when I watch this stuff play out this way, and I just say, there's nothing magical about what I do or how I look at things. All I do is go, what's his incentive? What's his incentive? What's his incentive? And then ask the simple question, who benefits and who doesn't? And then just, kind of run the incentive structure and then watch to see the way things play out and see who makes big moves and who doesn't. And just, and the hard part is separating the signal from the noise. Okay? There's so much noise out there. There's so many overlapping psyops and nonsense and who to listen to and who not to listen to. And I think is as good a skill, is as important a skill in this business as anything else, because it's so easy to get sidetracked with the latest flavor of the month. Peter Zahan, for example, who's just on Joe Rogan and was putting out the worst George Friedman style Strat 4 crap that I've seen in quite a while. But he's Kyle Bass 2.0, right? Like he's no different than Kyle Bass 10 years ago.
But most people are not literate in that way. No. When it comes to geopolitics, when it comes to finance, all these kinds of things, people are not, and they're illiterate by design, I would say.
I agree. But also at the end of the day, no one important is actually listening to him. It's the important part. So within the financial system, I'm talking about right now, because now you watch the way the financial markets trade, and that's where your clues are. Mm-hmm. So where the big moves are made. That's why I do both geopolitics and finance, and it's that interface that really I think is the important part, where those two immiscible liquids meet and sometimes do the bad thing. Go ahead.
Okay, so what happens now in the immediate future? I mean, we know spending, as we've discussed earlier, that's not in any kind of control. We have the Fed, as you explained, they're concerned about hyperinflation.
Sure.
They continue to raise interest rates. That brings on recession. And how does this then play out in the next 12 months?
It is a very rocky 2023. There's no way around it. We're going to have stagflation. It's going to be a replay of like 1976, 77. Gold is going to starting to rise. Commodity prices across the board will start to rise. We'll start to get a new round of inflation, I think, around Q2, where once we get past the baseline effects of the pump and dump in commodities, right? So commodities went through a massive pump and now they've dumped 50% and now they've reached a new baseline. Now they're going to start to creep higher again. And that's going to start to fuel CPI rises. And then that'll give the Fed every reason to keep raising interest rates. So the fight is going to be over regime change operations. As we've talked about in Congress, are there going to be, or how hard are they going to hold on to the Congress? What is the next shoe to drop for a big takeover in Europe? Right? Europe keeps trying to save itself by bolting on bigger problems. So they just bolted on Croatia the other day, right? They tried to take out the Swiss, right? With the attack on Credit Suisse 5 days after they took out the Bank of England, right? So, and then the Fed came in
and go deeper and deeper into debt. Oh my goodness.
Preaching to the converted, Peter. But look at what Erdogan's doing in Turkey. Like, what is look at what he's blown up in the last 2 weeks. Like, we're going to have an end of the Syrian conflict between Syria and Turkey, which is going to put the United States position in Syria and Iraq in serious trouble. Good. It's what the Fed wants. The Fed wants those troops to come home. Of course, the neocons want to take those troops and send them to Ukraine. So, like, where are they going to wind up? Probably in Ukraine. Even the Poles and the Germans are now angry at each other because the Brits have pushed the Poles to ask for reparations, and now we've got a fight within the European. Like, it doesn't make any sense anymore. But Erdogan just blew up Sweden into NATO. That was on Zero Hedge this morning, right before I got up, and like, okay, so or is that Sweden saying, we never really wanted to be in NATO anyway, because we don't really want to antagonize the Russians.
If you know where I live, you know my politics, and so right. When I see a circular firing squad of my foes, I keep my
kind of walk away.
Silence.
Well, the Russians are doing the same thing. I mean, I find all of this stuff really fascinating, and I'm not unwilling, unlike a lot of people on this side of the fence, which is the not virulently anti-Russian side of the fence. I'm willing to look at the way the Russians have prosecuted the war and what they've done. I am very sympathetic to all the moves that Putin's made. He's made some mistakes. They're real. Trusting Angela Merkel was the biggest mistake he ever made. And but I still have a tremendous amount of respect for what Putin has accomplished. Because what he's accomplished is nothing less than a reorganization of global politics. And you're not going to make 100% proper moves, even though you're kind of against you've got an enemy where you almost have to make perfect move after perfect move after perfect move. And
I think, Tom, George has really put it very well a few months ago. I think it was in the very beginning of the conflict. And George phrased it this way, which I think is perfect, is that, the mainstream media and their hacks in academia, like responsible statecraft and places like that, it's the Russia-Ukraine war. No, this is an assault by the collective West against Russia. And that is why so many countries around the world are watching with amazement, that the collective power of the West at this point in time, and I'm going to be very generous, a stalemate, which I think that's going to change very, very quickly in the next few months. But I mean, and George is absolutely right, and that is the paradigm shift. Is that finally one country has been able to stand up and say no, and it's getting its way, or at least it's certainly not caving.
Well, it's kind of the same. Go all the way back to the beginning of the conversation about the 20 Republicans who stood up. They got a lot done in this first round. But I identified, standing up and proving that this is the uniparty is a paper tiger in many ways. Look at what they got, every concession that they asked for. Now, whether or not it's going to get implemented, of course, okay, fine. They're going to try and get out of it in every way imaginable, of course. But they still forced every concession by just standing up, and the 20 of them standing up and saying no. That's pretty powerful. That proves to a lot of people that you can stand up and say no. Peter, I'll go back. The day that Putin walked into Syria was, to me, still the biggest geopolitical event of the 21st century. The speech at the UN on the 28th, and then they move in on the 30th. Yeah. I was working at Newsmax at the time, and I was writing the issue of my newsletter, and I sent it literally that week, and I sent it into my editor, and she was like, I called it that, and I said, she's like, Tom, you can't say that. I'm like, oh, yes, I can.
Well, Tom,
this is what's going to happen. And the next month, after he exposed the whole thing, and destroyed the entire ISIS is inviolable narrative, she was like, oh my God, you're so right. I'm like,
did I give you two numbers that you can bandy about if you want? Okay. Trump took credit for destroying ISIS. That's fine with me. Because I don't
Putin doesn't care.
Who cares? Okay. Yeah. But here's two numbers. Keep in mind: 25 planes in 6 weeks.
Yes.
And ISIS was destroyed. Let me say that again. 25 planes in 6 weeks.
I know.
And the raging civil war. No.
Yes.
How many contacts is the illegal occupying force, American forces in Syria had any contact with ISIS? Scant.
I know.
Over 2 years.
And then what happens 6 weeks into it? The CIA shoots down a Russian plane, tries to frame the Turks for it, and start World War III between Russia and the Turks. Erdogan makes the smart move, and Putin doesn't go off half-cocked because he's smart. And Erdogan calls him up and says, we didn't do that. They work it out, and Erdogan's reward for that is to attempt to be regime changed 6 months later out of Incirlik. which Putin warned him about. The Iranians smuggled him out of the country. I was on a live stream. I had a guy literally telling me on a live stream, he's like, no, Erdogan made that phone call on his iPhone from Iran. So, and then go look at Erdogan's relationship with Iran after that, evading the sanctions. Because remember, the entire time that Iran was kicked out of the SWIFT system, Iran was able to sell oil into the market through the Turkish banks who had remonetized gold as a reserve asset.
Well, Tom, thank you so much.
Brilliant.
There's so much to discuss. Unfortunately,
I know.
Pressure of time. But thank you, Tom, so much for giving us your time. And we need to do this again very soon because there's nowhere near enough time to cover so much ground.
I know, and I'm sorry if I hogged the mic here or there. I'm sorry about that. But guys, this was an absolute blast. I'm really glad we had a chance to talk, and I hope I'd be happy to do it again whenever you want. And if either of you want to come on my podcast, just we'll chat on Twitter DM.
It's very different than crosstalk because we get to talk a whole lot more.
Yeah, no, I do apologize a little bit, Peter, for the last time I was on crosstalk when I had to start talking over people and it turned into the original crosstalk like it was on CNN, where I was a little not polite, but
no, Tom. I mean, there was technical issues. Okay,
Yeah.
It wasn't your fault. It was a technical issue. There was a very long delay, and that's what happened. So
all right, fair enough. But just to let you know, the next time we come on, I really like to spend some time talking about the divide between this issue of what the United States actually looks like, because I think it's really important that we identify what the valid criticisms of the United States are and what its still potential positive role is in the world. I think we really need to nail that down. I think that's a very underserved part of the commentariat at this point.
I agree.
Okay?
All right. So thank you very much.
Take care.
And remember, if you like the Gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe.
And when you guys get a link, to send it to me and I'll put it out to my people.